We turn now to perhaps the most controversial philosopher that we'll look at this semester, and that is the philosopher Karl Marx. But before we dig into Marx, I think it would be good for us to think about some shifting concerns that have been happening in philosophy. Again, going back to the beginning of the semester when we were looking at the Greek philosophers, we talked about how they started with metaphysics, and on top of metaphysics, they built an epistemology, and on top of epistemology, they constructed a system of ethics. This is the old traditional way of thinking about philosophy. And then we talked about how the concern shifted in philosophy to making epistemology primary. This happens during the Enlightenment with the rationalists and the empiricists. And it wasn't that those philosophers weren't concerned with metaphysics or science or ethics or anything else. It's just that they argued, the rationalists and the empiricists, that we can talk about epistemology before we dive into other questions such as metaphysical questions. Well, now there are shifts happening again. And this shift is seen very clearly in Karl Marx, but you can see this in other thinkers as well, that ethics or political philosophy is becoming central. And we can talk about ethics before we dive into metaphysics or epistemology or anything else. And so ethics has a primary concern. And again, none of this means that metaphysics is not important for these philosophers. None of this means that epistemology is not important. But we just have to start where we are, and where we are, according to these philosophers, is we're concerned about ethical questions. And Marx falls into this camp. And it's important when we think about Karl Marx to think about the influences on Marx. And one very important influence is the philosopher Hegel. And Hegel, there's several things that are important about Hegel and his influence on Marx. But it's important to see that Hegel is rejecting Kant's philosophy, as well as many of the philosophers that come before Kant. And this really gets at how ethics is becoming a primary concern for the philosophers. So Hegel writes that to seek to know before we know is about as absurd as the wise resolution of the scholastic not to venture into the water until we have learned to swim. Now, what is Hegel saying here? Well, I think what he's saying is that what Kant and earlier philosophers are trying to do, whether we're talking about the Greek philosophers or whether we're talking about the rationalists and the empiricists, whether we're starting with metaphysics, whether we're starting with epistemology, all of these philosophers bought into the idea that we first need to set up a system of thought. We need to set up a philosophical worldview. For Kant, he was trying to get a proper method of thinking in terms of a transcendental method of thinking. And we need to set that up first, and then we can go on into exploring knowledge. And we can determine then how we know the things that we are seeking to know. Well, Hegel says that's not how knowledge actually works. It's like saying, I'm going to learn how to swim without getting into the water. If you want to learn how to swim, you have to be in the water. And in fact, when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to philosophy, we're already in the water and we're swimming. And so we need to, as it were, start where we are. Gaining knowledge is a process. Now, one of the ways that philosophers have tried to explain Hegel's thought is through this triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It's important to know that Hegel didn't actually use this terminology in explaining his philosophy, but for our purposes and how we're reflecting on Karl Marx, I think this triad will be helpful for understanding Hegel's thought, especially how it relates to Marx. So when you think of gaining knowledge as being a process, for Hegel you start with a thesis. And we can think of this as simply stating your initial belief. So all of us, when we're thinking about gaining knowledge or learning, we start somewhere. And so when you're presenting a thesis, you're sort of stepping out on a limb and you're saying, this is where I land. These are my opinions. And this is my philosophical perspective on life. You state that, and then you welcome an antithesis. And that can come in the form of either critiquing your own beliefs or inviting others to critique the thesis that you set out. And so you want to invite that so that you can come to a synthesis, which we can think of it in this case as more of a nuanced belief. So you set out what you think to be the case, you accept the critique of your thesis, and that allows you to grow in knowledge, which is what the synthesis is all about for Hegel. So rational reflection is dialectical. It happens through dialogue, and in fact, this gives us a whole picture of the history of philosophy, where you have philosophers who stated their thesis, the thesis that they have, whether we go back to the pre-Socratic philosophers or whether we go back to Plato, they stated a philosophical position that they're using to explain the world around them. But then later philosophers come and they critique that system. And what we should learn from that is that there's nuanced beliefs that we need to have. We construct a synthesis of much of this debate. And so Hegel was affirmed a dialectical philosophy, and specifically he was an idealist in the way that he thought about metaphysics. So this goes back to George Berkeley, where Berkeley argues that to be is to be perceived, and the world that we see around us doesn't reduce to matter and motion. Rather, the world around us reduces to perceptions or to ideas, and specifically, Berkeley was talking about the ideas of God. Hegel is an idealist in a similar way, and there can be some debate of whether or not he really believed in God or whether he did not believe in God. But one of the ways to think about idealism is to say that God is nature. There's no distinction between God and nature. So when Hegel's talking about God, he's really talking about the natural world. And the natural world is full of purpose. It's not reduced to matter and motion. And the natural world is also a historical process. And what makes Hegel's idealism so important is that he saw history as progressing somewhere. History is progressing to some sort of natural end. And this is where you get the whole notion of being on the right side of history, if you've ever heard that phrase before. The way that this works in Hegel's philosophy is that if history is moving to some sort of endpoint, then the right side of history is moving towards a synthesis. So you can have the rationalists disagreeing with the empiricists disagreeing with the rationalists. You can have Kant coming along trying to provide a synthesis for them. But as we're moving through history, we're developing our ideas, and this is how progress works. History is progressing to an end. So Marx was influenced by Hegel, but he was not influenced by Hegel's idealism. Marx liked the idea of ideas and history being a dialectical process, but he was a dialectical materialist. And he saw humans as being the product of circumstances and upbringing. So all of us are influenced by the things that we've learned, the family that we were born into. Marx made a big deal out of this. But part of what that means is that if we are the products of our circumstances and upbringing, then you can change human nature. And the way that you do this is you change human nature by changing the circumstances that they are brought up in. Now, the elites know this, and the elites will manipulate circumstances to change human nature, according to Marx. And this is an important idea when we think of many of the famous quotes that Marx is known for, such as the quote that religion is the opium of the people, the soul of the soulless conditions, and the heart of a heartless world. Now, what is Marx getting at in a quote like this? Well, one of the circumstances that the elite might create, according to Marx, would be a situation where you have the masses that are working, contributing to labor for the purpose of serving the elite. And so the elite enjoy the benefits of the labor of those who are in the lower classes. Well, how are you going to get the lower classes to be content with this? Well, one way that you might do it is religion. And I think what Marx is saying when he's talking and critiquing religion is that religion is sort of this idea that the elitists came up with to keep the masses content. It's the opium of the people. So people are suffering. How do you help people to cope with their suffering? Well, you don't want them to realize that it's the elites that are causing them to suffer, and so you develop an idea of religion so that it helps them deal with the pain. And in fact, the function of religion is to help us deal with suffering in life, according to Marx. It's a social construct. It's not something that is really real. It's a drug that we take as the masses so that we can deal with subpar economic conditions. Another famous quote, according to Marx, is that the philosophers have only interpreted the world, at least in various ways, but the point of philosophy, according to Marx, is to change it. We are not called as philosophers to interpret the world merely, but to change the world. And this gets back to Marx's whole understanding of the elites being in charge. Philosophers come along and they just try to explain the world as it is. Marx says if you want to be an honest philosopher, a philosopher who has any practical value, then you have to think about not just how to understand the world around you, but how to change the world. And in other words, education for Marx is really about activism. He writes that man must prove the truth of his thinking and practice. So it's not good enough to just have theories. You have to show how your theories actually make the world a better place. And so specifically for Marx, he says we should be seeking progress in doing philosophy and in education. And he takes Hegel's idea of the right side of history, to use that phrase. So, I mean, this isn't Marx's phrase or Hegel's phrase, but the idea is certainly there. And the right side of history for Marx is the progress we make toward removing class distinctions. And that's really what we should be seeking when we're seeking progress. Now, if you ask, well, where does he come up with this idea of removing class distinctions? Well, a lot of these ideas build off of the works of Charles Darwin. Now, it's important to note here that Charles Darwin, we have no evidence that Charles Darwin was sympathetic towards Marx's ideas. In fact, we have evidence to the contrary. Karl Marx read Charles Darwin. He wrote him a letter, and he says, I want to do what you're doing to biology, and I want to do this same kind of assessment for society as a whole. Charles Darwin seems to have rejected Karl Marx's proposal there, but it's important to note that Karl Marx is still influenced by Darwin's ideas, and so he wants to move Darwin from the world of just pure biology, and he wants to talk about social evolution. Now, this is not a huge leap for Marx, because when you think about what societies are composed of people, and people are biological, just like everything else is biological in the realm of life, and so this is not a huge leap for Karl Marx. And he wants to emphasize that social science is a science. It's not this separate thing that, today we like to talk about the humanities, so you have the sciences and the humanities. Marx wanted to make sure that what he was doing was viewed as a science. We can get evidence for the beliefs that we hold and our ideas about social evolution. And one of the big scientific questions that Marx wants to ask is, how could humans survive in a ruthless, survival-of-the-fittest natural world? And the answer that Marx gives is that we survived because humans are toolmakers and producers. In fact, the most effective tool that we've created is society itself, our social networks. And one of the ways that we can think about what Marx is getting at here is to think about what it takes to make a simple sandwich. Now, if I want to go make a sandwich right now, I'll just go into the kitchen and I'll get out a piece of bread, get out some mayo, I'll put some mayo on the bread, and then I'll get some turkey, put turkey on it, get some cheese, put some cheese on it, and it will take me less than a minute to make a simple sandwich. But if you think about that, that's pretty amazing that I could make a simple sandwich in less than a minute. What does it really take to make that simple sandwich? Well, it takes having cheese in a refrigerator, which means somebody had to have invented a refrigerator and mass-produced a refrigerator so that I could have one in my kitchen. Somebody had to do the work that it takes to make cheese. Somebody had to do the work that it takes to get the turkey put into packages so that I could buy it at the grocery store, and all the work that goes into getting all the food at the grocery store there. There has to be people working in checkout lines. There's a whole society that needs to be in place for us to make a simple sandwich, so that if I wanted to make a simple sandwich without society, it would take a lot more than a simple minute. And the most effective tool that we've created is our social relationships, according to Karl Marx. That's what helped us not just survive, but thrive. And so if you want to understand then how societies like this are birthed, and if you want to understand how they die, you have to understand the dialectic. And so now this is where he's bringing Hegel's thought into Darwin's thought. And the dialectic for Marx is really this tension that exists between two classes of people throughout history. And we'll talk about that just in a moment. But this gives us a framework for understanding what Marxism is all about. Now, I should say that we need to be careful whenever we attempt to answer a question like, what is Marxism? Because there's not just one interpretation of Marxist thoughts. There have been various streams of Marxist ideologies that have existed over the last century. And so we don't want to just state one idea and say this captures everything that Marxism is all about. And so what I'm going to be attempting to do is give you the most basic understanding of Marxism that I think that different streams of thought would probably agree to. And so Marxist thought really begins by pointing out some problems with John Locke's philosophy. So John Locke, at least when it comes to his political philosophy, argues that private property is the result of mixing my labor with the objects of nature. So if I am in the state of nature, as Locke might say, so the state of nature is before there's any civilization whatsoever. In the state of nature, everyone fends for themselves, according to Locke. Now, if I am walking through the state of nature and I come across an apple tree, well, does that apple tree belong to me? Well, according to Locke's understanding of private property, it doesn't belong to me until I do the work of picking the apples. And when I mix my labor, the labor of picking the apples, with the apple tree that exists in the state of nature, after I do that work, I can properly say that I own the apples that I've picked because I mix my labors with the objects of nature. Marx argues that under a capitalistic system, laborers do not own the objects that they make. Now, this isn't a direct critique of Locke, but most capitalists will go back to John Locke and say that it's really Locke's philosophy that provides the foundation for capitalist systems. And what Marx wants to say is, once we introduce capitalism into society, then what you have is a situation where the laborers don't actually have private property. Instead, under capitalism, the capitalists have the property. They own the production. They also own the means of production. And what the laborers do in a capitalist system is they create more wealth for the capitalists. And so capitalism, to maybe use the analogy of the apple tree again, under a capitalism, according to Marx, I would go and I would pick all the apples off the tree, but I don't get to own the apples. Instead, I am picking the apples and I'm giving them to the capitalists, and the capitalists are the ones that really own the production. And so the laborers in this system, according to Marx, simply become tools. And when that happens, they're disconnected from the meaning of work. Now, this is Marx's thought is really developing during a time period where work is becoming more industrial. And so a lot of work involves assembly lines and people doing very mindless work of working on an assembly line. And in that sense, Marx doesn't like that. He says this is really creating people to become tools, but not what John Locke had envisioned, where people get to own the fruit of their labor. And so this is the problem that he sees with Locke. Now, Marx sees himself at a time in history where, to go back to the idea of the dialect between how Hegel's influencing Marx, he sees there being class distinctions between what he calls the bourgeois class and the proletariat. And this is really where you have a thesis and antithesis in Marx's thinking. The bourgeoisie are the class of people who are really the modern capitalists. They're the ones who own the means of social production. And the proletariat sell their labor to the bourgeois class. This really is what capitalism is, according to Marx. And what's happening when you observe this class distinction is that the bourgeoisie are exploiting the proletariat. And so, in a sense, whether they realize it or not, they are the oppressive class, the oppressors. And the proletariat let this happen because they don't know that they're being exploited. They believe that they're getting paid fair wages. They agree to the terms, but they don't realize just how much the bourgeoisie is profiting off of their labor. And so they are the oppressed group, whether they realize it or not. So in this thesis, antithesis, we might ask the question, what is the synthesis between this tension between the bourgeois class and the proletariat? Well, the synthesis happens when the proletariat realize that they're being oppressed, and when they realize that, they will revolt. And this is not a good thing, at least the way that I understand Marx. This is not necessarily a good thing. It creates instability, and it also creates a new ruling class. Eventually, you have a different group that becomes the elites, or the bourgeois class, and they will just oppress a different group of people until they realize it, and you have this cycle of instability in Marxist thought. So, how do we solve this? Well, Marx thinks about just the history of human civilizations as being a history of class struggle. And he argues that in the early stages of human civilizations, so you got to think of hunter-gatherers, you actually have no classes, and he sees this as being kind of a primitive golden age, where if you have no classes, then you have no conflict. This is a good thing. But as history progressed, there was this economy that moved towards slavery. And so in this type of economy, you have slave owners and you have slaves. This obviously creates conflict. When the slaves realize that they're slaves and they're being oppressed, they'll eventually revolt. And this moves to another stage of feudalism, where it's not quite as brutal as slavery, but you still have landowners and you have serfs. You still have this clear class distinction. And then you get to the capitalist society that Marx is critiquing, where he talks about the bourgeois class and the proletariat. Again, this is better than slavery or feudalism that comes before it. This is a more moral system. And in that sense, he can see John Locke as being an improvement upon what came before him. But this is not where history is headed. If we want to continue to progress, be on the right side of history, we would move towards socialism. And this is where you still have class distinctions, but now the class distinction is you have state managers versus workers, and you try to make sure that at least the class distinctions that exist among the workers is less pronounced, and then eventually you get to a communist state where you have no classes and you have no conflict. And this is the end of history. This is where history is moving towards, and that is why Marx is a dialectical materialist. So he's not an idealist like Hegel, who thinks that everything in nature reduces to ideas. He really believes in what was considered a scientific mindset in that day, where everything reduces to matter and motion. He wants to emphasize the sciences, but history is still moving toward that end. And part of the job of societies is to help it move toward that end and progress toward that end. Now, in doing that, when you think of this whole Marxist way of looking at the world, it changes the way that we think of the various institutions in society. Whether we're talking about the scientific community, whether we're talking about medicine. On the screen I have some of the earlier schools of philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, and other things. Whatever institution it is that we're thinking about, if you want to give a Marxist critique of that system, you want to make sure that that system is not contributing to the exploitation of the proletariat. And if it does, we need to get rid of those institutions, or at least change them so that they are more consistent with Marxist approach to ethics and political philosophy.